In today's episode of Explaining Russia, you will learn how the Soviet Union initially viewed Nazi Germany, why Stalin argued that war against Nazism was an act of stupidity, and what conditions the USSR set for joining an alliance with Hitler.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи.
Вот так лучше. Я взял другие очки.
June 22nd, one of the most important and tragic dates in the history of the Soviet Union. On that day in 1941, German troops invaded Soviet territory, marking the beginning of one of the most significant chapters of World War II, the German-Soviet War, which would last until 1945. In modern Russia, however, this is more than just a historical date. June 22nd has become one of the central pillars of state propaganda, serving as the starting point of the myth of Russia's sacred battle against Nazism. According to this narrative, the Soviet Union, because of its uncompromising rejection of Nazism, could not remain on the sidelines and was therefore forced into a long and bitter struggle against absolute evil. Despite suffering enormous losses, the Soviet Union ultimately succeeded in saving not only itself from the Nazi menace, but humanity as a whole. According to Vladimir Putin, this battle was made even more difficult by the fact that other nations had been conquered and became just obedient accomplices to Nazi Germany's crimes, leaving Russia alone, face to face with the greatest evil of all times.
В самое трудное время войны, в решающих сражениях, определивших исход борьбы с фашизмом, наш народ был один на многотрудном, героическом и жертвенном пути к победе.
It is worth noting that this is a rather bold claim. Neither Russia's first president Boris Yeltsin nor any leader of the Soviet Union ever went so far as to say that we were alone. Yet, when it comes to the subject of today's video, Vladimir Putin is actually absolutely right in saying that during the war with the Nazis, the Soviet Union, the Soviet people were alone, the only ones. There is, however, one important nuance to that which we'll discuss in a moment, but in essence, that was indeed how the Soviet Union was portrayed by Soviet propaganda itself across virtually every form of media. Here is, for example, the celebratory order from May 1st, 1941, that is International Workers' Day. The order was issued, published in all Soviet newspapers, and solemnly delivered in Red Square before thousands of Soviet people by the Soviet Minister of Defense Semyon Timoshenko. Comrades, only our great motherland, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, stands as an unshakable rock amid the stormy sea of international events. Thanks to the wise Stalinist foreign policy of the Soviet government, we remain outside the war, and the Soviet people enjoy the blessings of peace. So what about everyone else in the world? Glad you asked, Timoshenko would have said, as it was a complete disaster there. The Second Imperialist War, launched for profit and the redivision of the world, has become a world war and has engulfed nearly all capitalist countries. The war is being fought in Europe, Asia, and Africa. It is fed by the resources of North and South America. It rages on land, at sea, and in the air, spreading death and destruction and bringing every imaginable hardship upon the working masses. So it turns out that there was indeed a big war going on. It was only the Soviet people who were the only ones outside of it. Here is the front page of Pravda, one of the Soviet Union's major newspapers, from the same date, May 1st, 1941. The message in the article is essentially the same, just expressed in much grander language. Under the merciless fire of total war, where no distinction exists between front and rear, stands the entirety of capitalist Europe. The war has spread to Africa. It rages across the Atlantic, its thunderous echo drawing ever closer to America. Its ominous glow burns ever brighter above the Pacific Ocean. Amid bloody battles on land, at sea, and in the air, through exhausting labor under the threat of bombs and fires, millions of workers in the capitalist countries greet May 1st. Meanwhile, in the USSR, The Soviet Union is the beautiful springtime of humanity, a union of brotherly republics fertilized by the genius of Lenin. The Soviet Union has withstood the pressure of the raging waves of the imperialist war. The peoples of the USSR enjoy all the benefits of peaceful and creative labor. The wise Stalinist foreign policy of the Soviet Union has thwarted the schemes of the imperialists who sought to draw the Soviet Union into military conflicts. So, in a sense, the Soviet Union really was alone during the war, just not exactly in the way that modern Russian propaganda tries to present it. And so that Soviet citizens would not forget and would fully understand what was happening around them, every issue of Pravda devoted an entire page to military reports from around the world. You could pick up any issue from this period. For example, in this same May 1st edition, we find German High Command report, the situation on the Greek front, military operations in Africa and the Mediterranean, military operations in China, President Roosevelt's press conference statement, Churchill's statement on military losses in Greece, and so on, every single day. So it is hardly surprising that the Soviet people opening Pravda each morning and reading about the war raging everywhere, while they alone enjoyed the blessings of peace, would indeed appreciate the wise foreign policy of the USSR that kept them outside the war. But in light of what we know today, especially after decades of Russian propaganda and particularly the words of Vladimir Putin, a question naturally arises, so what about all those talks of sacred war against Nazism, of saving humanity from total and merciless evil? Was it really right that the USSR remained outside the war? And the Soviet press had an answer to that question as well. The Soviet people did not need to get involved, because this is a war of capitalists fought over world domination, and the working class has no need for it. It all began back in October 1939, when the Izvestia newspaper published an editorial article on its front page titled Peace or War. There was no author stated, but the thing is that Izvestia functioned in modern terms as something of Stalin's Twitter or Truth Social account, if you will. Moreover, the archives preserve a draft of the article containing extensive handwritten corrections made by Stalin himself. So while someone else may have written the original text, the sheer amount of Stalin's edits makes him at the very least a co-author. The online archive of the Presidential Library of the Russian Federation, for example, directly lists Stalin as the author. Anyway, let's get to the article. Just to remind you once again, this was October 9th, 1939. It was just a little more than a month after the outbreak of World War II, and one of the Soviet Union's main newspapers was explaining to Soviet citizens exactly how they were supposed to understand what was happening. In the speech before the German Reichstag on October 6, the head of the German government, Hitler, outlined Germany's proposals for resolving the Polish question and ending the war. The article is quite lengthy. Here I provide the main excerpts. So Comrade Stalin continues. Hitler's proposals may be accepted, rejected, or amended in one way or another, but in no way can it be denied that they may serve as a real and practical basis for negotiations aimed at achieving peace as quickly as possible. One might assume, in view of this, that the governments of England and France, which emphasize in their declarations their desire for peace, would take seriously the possibility of a quick end to the war. However, the reaction of the British and French press to Hitler's proposals does not yet indicate such an approach on their part. Most newspapers are demanding that Hitler's peace proposals be dismissed without any consideration whatsoever, and that the war must continue until the complete achievement of those goals that Britain and France set for themselves when they entered the war. As one of their principal objectives, they now proclaim the destruction of Nazism. It's worth noting that here Stalin personally placed the word Nazism in quotation marks, thereby expressing his dismissive attitude toward the very idea. The fight against Nazi ideology, that is how British and French politicians framed the goal of the ongoing war. Can these arguments for continuing the war be considered in any way sound or convincing? every person is free to express their attitude toward one ideology or another and has the right either to defend it or reject it. But it is senseless and absurd cruelty to exterminate people simply because someone dislikes certain views or beliefs. One may respect or hate Nazism, just as one may respect or hate any other system of political views. That is a matter of taste. But to start a war for the sake of the destruction of Nazism is to commit in politics an act of criminal stupidity. After the proper ideological framework had been established, less than a month later came Comrade Molotov with his famous speech on the foreign policy of the Soviet government. By the way, there is one detail I'd like to mention, as I often notice various documentaries referring to Molotov simply as the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs. That is indeed true, but only partially. The thing is that first and foremost, Vyacheslav Molotov was the head of the Soviet government, that is, the Prime Minister, while at the same time also holding the position of Foreign Minister. In other words, Molotov was not merely one of several high-ranking Soviet officials, but quite literally the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union after Stalin himself. But let's return to Molotov's speech of October 31, 1939. It is difficult to say whether it was more of a report or a performance. Looking through the transcript, one can see that the speech was often interrupted because the audience either erupted into applause or burst into laughter. And Molotov was indeed just crushing it and seemed to be having a good time. It was in this speech that he famously named Poland the ugly offspring of the Treaty of Versailles, living at the expense of oppressing non-Polish nationalities, with the latter part actually being true, though nowadays the Polish government prefers to pretend otherwise. As for the rest of the speech, Molotov joked and gloated about the security guarantees given to Poland that had proved entirely useless. He mocked Britain's diplomatic protest over the Soviets' constant violations of the blockade against Germany. The most important part of the report, however, lay in Molotov's declaration of the Soviet Union's consistent efforts to improve relations with Germany and its wholehearted support for Germany's pursuit of peace in Europe. In essence, it was simply a repetition of what had already been stated a month earlier in the newspaper article, but now expressed as an official position of the Soviet government regarding Germany and the war that had just begun. One may accept or reject the ideology of Nazism, just as one may accept or reject any other ideological system. That is a matter of political views. But anyone can understand that an ideology cannot be destroyed by force. It cannot be ended through war. Therefore, it's not only senseless but criminal to wage such a war as a war for the destruction of Nazism, concealed beneath the false banner of a fight for democracy. And of course, the word democracy was also placed in quotation marks. Next, on November 7, 1939, during the October Revolution parade, the Soviet Minister of Defense at the time, Kliment Voroshilov, addressed Soviet soldiers and sailors with the following statement. The European war in which Britain and France act as its instigators and most zealous continuators has not yet grown into a raging inferno. But the Anglo-French aggressors, note that they are now called aggressors, but the Anglo-French aggressors, showing no desire for peace, are doing everything possible to intensify the war and spread it to other countries. And finally, on November 30, 1939, Stalin himself, for the first time in many years and for many years afterward, gave an interview to a journalist from Izvestia in which he stated the following. It was not Germany that attacked France and Britain, but France and Britain that attacked Germany, thereby taking responsibility for the current war. After the outbreak of hostilities, Germany approached France and Britain with peace proposals, and the Soviet Union openly supported Germany's peace proposals because it believed and continues to believe that a fast end to the war would fundamentally improve the situation of all countries and peoples. The ruling circles of France and Britain rudely rejected both Germany's peace proposals and the Soviet Union's attempts to secure a fast end to the war. These are the facts. Facts indeed. Of course, some might argue that everything mentioned previously came merely from newspaper interviews, propaganda speeches, and the like, and that what truly matters are actions. But first of all, these were not merely words. When a country launches an unprovoked war of aggression against peaceful nations, causing democratic states either to declare war on it or at the very least impose a boycott, any support that weakens that isolation becomes a major factor in sustaining the aggressor, whether in the form of official government statements, shipments of vital resources, or even symbolic public events, say a hockey match in Moscow. It all matters. And German leaders understood this perfectly well, responding to Soviet support with gratitude. As Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary regarding the October Izvestia article, a highly positive and anti-Entente article in Izvestia, one that fully does justice to our position. At this moment, it is extraordinarily useful to us and has been received with gratitude. The Russians have thus far kept every promise they have made. Or take a look at this excerpt from a conversation between Molotov and the German ambassador to the Soviet Union, Schulenburg. The Soviet government regards Hitler's speech as the basis for peace negotiations. In the article Peace or War, England was branded as the instigator of the war. No one else has done anything of the sort. Or this passage from discussions between German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and Stalin during Ribbentrop's visit to Moscow. After Ribbentrop stated that Germany did not require military assistance from the Soviet Union, Stalin replied that this was a very tactful and appropriate way of putting it, that Germany was not requesting military aid and did not intend to drag the Soviet Union into the war. It is a fact that Germany at present has no need of outside assistance and may not require such assistance in the future. However, if, contrary to expectations, Germany should find itself in a difficult situation, it may be certain that the Soviet people will come to Germany's aid and will not allow Germany to be strangled. The Soviet Union is interested in a strong Germany and will not allow Germany to be brought to its knees. Such touching sentiments from one of the future leaders of the anti-Nazi coalition. And now let's move from words, important but nonetheless intangible, to something very tangible, so to speak, material support, which can be measured and counted. When discussing Soviet-German cooperation, the first thing usually mentioned is the trade agreement between the two countries. It's worth noting that for each side, the effect and significance of this trade differed substantially. Germany primarily received raw materials from the Soviet Union. During the period the agreements were in force, Germany received 1.6 million tons of grain, almost 1 million tons of oil, 500,000 tons of iron ore, 200,000 tons of cotton, 200,000 tons of phosphates, 20,000 tons of chrome, or 18,000 tons of rubber, 200,000 kilograms of platinum, and so on. When evaluating these numbers, there are at least two important points that should be taken into consideration. First, the level of Germany's dependence on important raw materials necessary for its economy. You may sometimes hear claims that German pilots invading France in 1940 were eating Soviet bread and flying planes powered by Russian fuel. This is not entirely accurate, as Germany's dependence on Soviet supplies in these two particular categories was not especially critical at the time. For example, Soviet oil exports covered roughly 10% of Germany's overall consumption. Meanwhile, the share of food imports in Germany's total agricultural consumption during this period was approximately 8%. So, in these two particular areas, Soviet supplies were significant, but not as critical as some narratives suggest. However, in other sectors, the dependence was indeed very high. For example, Germany's reliance on certain metals and materials was substantial: lead around 50%, copper 70%, tin 90%, aluminum 99%, rubber over 85%, and so on. In those areas, Soviet deliveries were indeed an extremely significant help to the German economy. But regardless of the percentage of dependence, the key point is simpler: that Germany was able to obtain these materials at all. Which brings us to the second crucial point, often overlooked in discussions of 1939 and 1940. It is very common to hear that after declaring war on Germany following its invasion of Poland, Britain and France essentially did nothing, which is why this period became known as the Phony War. It is true that Allied military activity was limited. What is often forgotten, however, is that the Allied strategy during the Phony War was essentially an economic war of attrition. Instead of launching large-scale land offensives, Britain and France relied on a naval blockade to gradually cripple Germany's ability to wage war by cutting off imports of essential resources and materials. The Allies replicated the successful blockade strategy of World War I, hoping to starve the German economy of the resources needed to sustain its military expansion. And perhaps this strategy might have succeeded once again, except that the Allies did not expect the blockade to be undermined by none other than the very sacred fighter against Nazism, the Soviet Union. But Soviet assistance was not limited to economics alone, it also included direct military cooperation. And I'm not talking about the most obvious example, the joint invasion of Poland, which we'll cover in one of the upcoming videos, but about lesser-known episodes, for example the Soviet role in helping transfer a German cruiser from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Here is a picture of the German auxiliary cruiser Comet. Originally she had been a passenger and cargo ship named Ems, but she was later reinforced and armed with naval guns and torpedo tubes. On July 3, 1940, she departed on her first raiding voyage from Gotenhafen, today the Polish port of Gdynia. One important detail is that she sailed under a red flag, disguised as the Soviet icebreaker Semyon Dizhnyov. After arriving in a Soviet port, Comet took Soviet maritime pilots on board and, escorted first by the icebreaker Vladimir Lenin and later by the icebreaker Joseph Stalin, made her way through the Soviet Arctic. After passing through the Bering Strait into the Pacific Ocean, she went on to wreak havoc in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Long story short, Comet's raiding voyage lasted 516 days. During that time, she sank 7 Allied merchant ships totaling more than 41,000 tons, destroyed a British phosphate processing plant on Nauru, and also destroyed oil storage facilities, resulting in the loss of 13,000 tons of oil. After completing her mission, Comet returned to Hamburg on November 30, 1941. For the success of the operation, her captain, Robert Eisen, was promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral. According to the Hague Convention of 1907, this fact alone could arguably have made the Soviet Union, if not an outright ally of Germany, then at the very least a state whose behavior was incompatible with the status of a neutral country, a label which the Soviet Union continued to claim for itself. Yet somehow nobody ever mentions it. So what did the Soviet Union receive from Germany in return? Interestingly, while Germany received raw materials, oil, food, ore, and other resources, the Soviet Union demanded high-technology products in exchange. The USSR acquired hundreds of the most up-to-date examples of German military and industrial technology. Among them were samples of 35 of Germany's latest warplanes, including Bf-109 fighters and U-88 bombers, as well as aircraft engines, aviation weapons and ammunition, various aviation systems and avionics, including bomb sights and automatic dive recovery system. The Soviets also received heavy field howitzers, anti-aircraft guns with full ammunition supplies, the latest anti-tank guns, a Panzer III medium tank, half-track tractors, and much more. For the Soviet Navy, Germany supplied the incomplete heavy cruiser Lutsev, which later became the Soviet cruiser Petropavlovsk, 5 additional dual-purpose vessels, complete machinery for a large destroyer, heavy naval guns, an 88mm submarine gun, stereoscopic range fighters, periscopes, naval mines, sonar equipment, magnetic compasses, and even plans for the battleship Bismarck. And that is only the military equipment. The largest part of Germany exports consisted of industrial machinery, including nearly 6,500 metal-cutting machine tools. The Soviet Union also received locomotives, turbines, generators, and diesel engines. The list is virtually endless. As Molotov noted in a telegram to the Soviet ambassador in London in 1940, the agreement was economically beneficial for the USSR since the country was receiving large quantities of machinery, industrial equipment, and weapons from Germany. But this raises an obvious question. Why was Hitler so willing to transfer his newest military technologies to Stalin? After all, it was perfectly clear that when the Soviet Union requested 2 or 3 examples of every new aircraft model, it was not planning to simply operate them in the Red Army. The purpose of obtaining multiple samples of the same aircraft was to conduct comprehensive testing, develop countermeasures, and quite possibly copy useful design features for Soviet projects. Of course, Hitler understood this perfectly well, but he also understood something else. In the coming war in Europe, whichever side the Soviet Union joined would almost certainly emerge victorious. It is only in the narratives of modern Russian propaganda that the Soviet Union appears weak and unprepared for war. The reality was the opposite. Year after year, almost the entire Soviet economy was directed toward military production, manufacturing and accumulating weapons on an enormous scale. In terms of tanks and aircraft, the USSR possessed more than all the major European powers combined. That was what Hitler was willing to pay almost any price for. And it was not only Hitler who understood this. For example, let's look at this telegram sent by the Soviet ambassador to France, Yakov Sudets, describing the mood within French political circles after the outbreak of war with Germany. According to Sudets, the French leadership thought that the war will continue until Germany is completely defeated. Confidence in eventual victory is based primarily on the overwhelming superiority of the Allies' war potential, especially in economic terms. The American policy of neutrality has not shaken the belief that sooner or later America will enter the war on the side of the Allies. In this situation, it is only the Soviet Union that can alter this balance of forces in Germany's favor. For this reason, the position of the USSR is the subject of the greatest speculation and concern. This report is dated September 10, 1939, that is, before the Soviet invasion of Poland. Now let's move forward to September 20th. By this point, the Soviet Union had already invaded Poland. Sudets reported that their last hope that the Soviet intervention had been intended to oppose Germany rather than partition Poland had now completely faded. As for the Soviet invasion itself, the French government had so far adopted a wait-and-see attitude. But the most important part of the report was the following observation. The question of whether the USSR will support Germany on the Western Front overshadows all others and is the subject of all concern and anxiety. Notice that they are no longer talking about Poland or the Eastern Front. They are discussing the Western Front and the possibility of Soviet army supporting Germany against France. Today, after decades of Russian propaganda portraying the Soviet Union as an undisputed fighter against Nazism, such concerns may sound absurd and unimaginable. Yet it appears that in Paris in 1939, this question overshadowed all others and was the subject of all concern and anxiety. To be fair, this concern was not limited to Paris, nor to 1939. If we return to the previously mentioned telegram from Molotov to the Soviet ambassador in London in 1940 regarding the trade agreement with Germany, the primary issue discussed was the ambassador's question of how to respond to British inquiries about rumors of a possible Soviet-German military alliance. Molotov replied that it was both ridiculous and insulting even to suggest that the Soviet Union had entered into a military alliance with Germany. Even political simpletons do not enter into a military alliance with a side already involved in war, understanding all the complexity and risks involved in such an alliance. And one thing is certain, that Molotov and Stalin were anything but simpletons, which is precisely why, after Hitler had indeed offered such an alliance in 1940, the Soviet leadership, taking into consideration all the complexity and risks involved in such an alliance, presented Germany in November 1940 with the conditions under which the Soviet Union was ready to join the Axis alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan. By some miracle, the original document containing those conditions has survived in the Soviet archives, bearing Molotov's signature and a handwritten note stating that he personally handed it to the German ambassador Schulenburg. The fact that Germany ultimately rejected these conditions as excessive, particularly the Soviet demands expanding its sphere of influence toward the Persian Gulf, is a different story altogether. By that point, Hitler had already concluded that Stalin could not be trusted as an ally, and a month later, on December 18, 1940, he signed Directive 21, better known as Operation Barbarossa, the plan for the invasion of the USSR. But the fact remains that the Soviet Union's later sacred battle against Nazism occurred not because of some uncompromising rejection of Nazi ideology, as modern Russian propaganda would have you believe, but arguably because even Hitler was stunned by the scale of Stalin's demands. We will never know for certain what exactly encouraged such bold demands from the ever-cautious Stalin. One possible reason may have been his successes in acquiring new territories in 1939 and 1940. As the saying goes, appetite comes with eating, and having the largest land army in the world certainly fueled Stalin's appetite. Of course, the Winter War against Finland and then the German invasion of 1941 would show that the USSR was little more than a colossus with feet of clay. But before those events, few doubted the power of the gigantic Red Army, and the effort invested in building it was indeed colossal. Not all of those efforts were successful, though. One such example was when the Soviet military leadership decided to drastically rearm almost every branch of the Soviet army with new types of cannons. Tank-caliber guns were now mounted on motorcycles, battleship-caliber guns on tiny destroyers, and previously unimaginable caliber guns on small fighters. This episode went down in history as the Recoilless madness, becoming one of the largest and most expensive Soviet military failures. On my other channel devoted to Soviet aviation history, I made a video covering this fascinating episode, which you can watch exclusively on my streaming service Nebula. Nebula is a place where you can watch hours of high-quality exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. It's where I, along with a growing community of more than 200 creators, release original, thoughtful, and ad-free content on a wide range of topics: history, science, art, travel, politics, you name it. What makes Nebula different is that it was built by creators and is owned by creators, myself included. In this case, different is not just a grander sounding word, but a real distinction that benefits both creators and viewers who enjoy thoughtful, high-quality content. For example, when you sign up using my link in the description, I receive a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you remain subscribed. That support helps us continue improving our content, going beyond the limits of YouTube with longer run times, deeper analysis, and the freedom to explore virtually any compelling topic without restriction. And for you, it means no ads, no sponsorship interruptions, just premium content that keeps growing every day. A large portion of that content is available exclusively on Nebula, including Red Atoms by Real Time History, Jet Lag by Vandover Productions, Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore, Battle of Britain by Real Engineering, and one of my personal favorites, Unsealed by Mustard, along with many more projects that would not be possible without the support of Nebula subscribers. In fact, if it weren't for Nebula's approach to historical content, I probably would never have started this very channel. I'm not a big production studio, it's just me behind all these videos, and based on my experience with my other channel, where almost every video goes through a lengthy review process or ends up being demonetized by YouTube, starting another history channel would simply be too risky and unsustainable. To continue making videos, I would have to either soften my approach and the way I present information, or stop making them altogether. But I don't want to go down that path, because I strongly believe in what I'm doing. We must learn from the experiences of the past and from the mistakes of others. In that regard, Russia's history is indeed an extraordinary source of lessons, filled with enormous and, unfortunately, often tragic mistakes. If you believe that Russia's real history deserves to be studied more thoroughly, you can support my work by subscribing to Nebula. And the timing couldn't be better. If you go to nebula.tv/Comrade Kroupsky, or click the link in the description, or scan the QR code, you will get 50% off an annual subscription, bringing the price down to just $30 per year, or only $250 per month. And if you'd rather not deal with another subscription, you can choose a lifetime membership and pay once for unlimited access forever. So click the link to get 50% of an annual subscription and support Comrade Kroupsky. And as always, thank you so much for watching.